Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Geostrategic Podcast. Thank you for watching or listening to the podcast. You're looking at a map that no longer exists. Northern Europe, once a quiet edge of NATO, is rapidly becoming the alliance's most critical line of defense. With Sweden and Finland now inside NATO, a new strategic arc is forming, from the Baltic Sea to the Arctic, and it's reshaping the balance of power with Russia in ways most people still don't fully understand. So the real question is this a stabilizing shield or the start of something far more dangerous? In the next few minutes, we'll break down exactly what's changing, why it matters, and what could come next. But before we dive in, if you're into sharp, no-nonsense geopolitical analysis, hit like, subscribe, and share this video. It helps more than you think. And I want to hear from you. Is NATO strengthening deterrence or escalating the risk? Drop your take in the comments. The debate on this one is wide open.
Yeah, and to really grasp the sheer scale of the geopolitical earthquake you just laid out, you kind of have to mentally erase the map of Europe you grew up with.
Right, completely start over.
Exactly, because for the entirety of the Cold War and, the 3 decades following it, there was this massive, ambiguous territory spanning across Northern Europe.
Because Sweden and Finland were technically non-aligned.
Right. They formed this vast, quiet buffer zone between the West and Russian territory. But that buffer is officially gone now. I mean, the NATO-Russia border practically doubled in length overnight.
It's wild. And the catalyst bringing the reality of this all to a head right now is the upcoming May 21st and 22nd, 2026 meeting in Helsingborg, Sweden. Let's just pause and appreciate the historical whiplash here, right? You have Sweden, a country that hasn't fought a war in, over 2 centuries?
Yeah, a really long time.
A nation that literally built its modern global identity on strict neutrality, managing to stay out of both world wars. And now they are hosting NATO foreign ministers.
It really is a staggering historical pivot. They aren't just sitting in the back of the room anymore. They are acting as the geographic keystone of a massive new military bloc.
Yep.
When you look at the latest updates regarding the Baltic Sea region, it is essentially ringed by allied nations now. We're talking about a united, continuous front. Norway, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, and the Baltic states. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania.
The whole coast, basically.
Exactly. The tactical reality of the region has just been entirely rewired from the ground up.
So I want to zoom in on Sweden's role for a second, specifically the island of Gotland. I hear analysts constantly refer to it as like the key to the Baltic. But frankly, if we just look at a map, it's a relatively small piece of land.
It is, yeah.
What mechanically makes it so important? Like if you put troops or weapons there, what does that actually do to Russia's military capabilities?
Well, it comes down to a military strategy called A2AD, anti-access area denial.
Okay, so pushing them out.
Right. In modern warfare, controlling territory isn't just about, putting soldiers on a beach. It's about using long-range weapons to create this invisible three-dimensional bubble that enemy forces just cannot safely enter. And Gotland sits smack in the middle of the Baltic Sea. So if you place advanced anti-ship missiles and surface-to-air missile batteries on that island, their radar and engagement ranges overlap with the European mainland.
Oh, wow. So it's like setting up this massive overlapping radar and weapons net right over the water. You control the airspace on the surface without needing, 1,000 ships patrolling constantly.
Exactly. The physical reality is that it completely chokes off the Russian Baltic fleet, because Russia has this highly militarized exclave called the Kaliningrad, sandwiched between Poland and Lithuania alongside their main naval base in St. Petersburg.
Right.
Previously, their ships and aircraft had relatively open pathways through the Baltic. Now, any vessel leaving Kaliningrad or St. Petersburg has to navigate through waters heavily covered by Swedish and Allied missile umbrellas.
So you physically block their ability to move troops or, launch amphibious assaults without immediately facing intersecting lines of fire.
Exactly. It completely changes the maths for them.
That makes total sense. It's about dominating the geometry of the sea. But then, right next door, you have Finland. By joining the alliance, Finland added over 800 miles of direct land border with Russia?
Yeah, roughly that, yeah.
On paper, that sounds like a massive vulnerability. We now have to defend an extra 800 miles of dense, freezing forest. How does that make the alliance safer?
I know, it seems counterintuitive at first, until you look at the specific capabilities of the Finnish defense forces. You have to remember, Finland didn't enter the alliance empty-handed, just begging for a shield.
Right.
Because of their history, specifically the Winter War against the Soviet Union. Finland actually never abandoned mass conscription after the Cold War ended.
Oh, really? I didn't realize that.
Yeah, so they bring one of the largest, most sophisticated artillery reserves in all of Europe. We're talking about thousands of pieces of heavy artillery, vast stockpiles of ammunition, and a society that can mobilize hundreds of thousands of highly trained reservists in literally a matter of days.
Wow. Okay, so instead of stretching the alliance thin, Finland acts as this massive, heavily armed anvil on that northeastern flank. They basically built their entire society around the possibility of fighting a ground war in the snow against a neighbor coming from the east.
Their infrastructure reflects that perfectly, too. Highway strips in Finland are designed to be converted into fighter jet runways in hours. Bridges are literally pre-wired for demolition to halt advancing tanks.
That is intense.
Yeah. Finland's entry fundamentally secures the land domain in a way that foreign reinforcements simply couldn't achieve quickly enough on their own.
Which connects back to something that has always been a strategic nightmare for the West. The Baltic states,
Yeah.
Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania.
No.
In the past, they were essentially this exposed peninsula, right? They were completely dependent on distant reinforcements that had to squeeze through a tiny, vulnerable sliver of land between Poland and Kaliningrad, the Suwalki Gap.
A major choke point.
Right. It was like a neighborhood at the end of a very long, very vulnerable dirt road. But with Sweden and Finland in, it feels like that road just became a fortified highway. Does this practically change how quickly we can get tanks or troops there in a crisis, though?
Oh, it radically alters the logistical math. Before, if the Suwalki Gap was closed in a conflict, the Baltics were completely cut off by land.
Leaving them totally stranded.
Right. Resupply would require forcing cargo ships through heavily contested waters, taking heavy losses. But now you have the Swedish landmass as a secure rear area.
Okay, so how does the route work now?
Well, you can offload heavy armor at safe ports on Norway's Atlantic coast, far away from Russian anti-ship missiles. Then you move it by rail across the Scandinavian mountains into Sweden and ferry it directly across the secure Baltic Sea to Estonia or Latvia.
Totally bypassing those deadly choke points.
Exactly.
Wait, I want to clarify something on the logistics flow there. Moving heavy armor isn't as simple as driving civilian trucks down a highway. You're talking about massive trains hauling 70-ton main battle tanks. Don't Finland and Sweden use entirely different rail systems?
Yeah, that is a very real mechanical hurdle the alliance is currently grappling with. Finland actually operates on a wider rail gauge. It's a legacy of its history with the Russian Empire.
Oh, sure.
Whereas Sweden uses the standard European gauge. So you can't just drive a freight train from Stockholm directly to Helsinki.
Which is a problem if you're trying to build a fortified highway.
Exactly. To make this work, engineering corps have to streamline the transfer points. They are actively expanding these specialized rail hubs at the border where armored vehicles can roll off a Swedish train and onto a Finnish one really rapidly.
I imagine standardizing that kind of gritty port and rail infrastructure is incredibly expensive.
It is a massive undertaking, and it's heavily featured on the agenda at Helsingborg for that exact reason.
Okay, so securing the Baltic and solving those rail issues is a huge strategic win. But if you have this amazing fortified highway, it's completely useless if the supply lines feeding into it from the Atlantic are severed. Which brings us to the next piece of this map, the high north, the Arctic. And here is where I really have to push back a bit on the latest info. When you hear Arctic, you think of, scientific research stations, icebreakers, climate studies. You don't think of a high-tech military flashpoint.
Yeah, that's the traditional view.
Right. So if NATO starts aggressively militarizing the high north, aren't we just playing right into Russia's hands by escalating tensions in a region they already completely dominate?
Well, the assumption that the Arctic is just this peaceful scientific preserve is, honestly, dangerously outdated now. Look at the recent structural changes in the Russian military. Their northern fleet, which is based on the Kola Peninsula, is the absolute crown jewel of their navy.
The crown jewel, not the Baltic fleet.
No, the northern fleet. It houses the vast majority of their ballistic missile submarines, which form the core of their nuclear deterrent. And as the Arctic ice recedes, new commercial and military sea lanes are opening up. Russia has spent the last decade heavily fortifying the area with specialized Arctic bases, ice-capable warships, advanced air defense systems, you name it.
So it's not about polar bears, it's about projecting global power from the top of the world.
Exactly. And it is also about what is happening deep underwater.
Under the ice.
Right. Think about the transatlantic undersea cables. The physical infrastructure that carries like 95% of international internet traffic and trillions of dollars in daily financial transactions. They run right through these northern waters.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about the cables.
Yeah, and recent updates indicate Russian specialized submersibles, particularly their ultra-quiet nuclear-powered Yasin-class submarines, are lingering incredibly close to these vital communications lines. These are highly advanced deep-sea assets capable of tapping or completely severing the data arteries that keep Western economies functioning.
So if a conflict picks off, the first shot might not even be a missile. It might be the sudden blackout of global financial markets because a submarine severed a cable off the coast of Norway.
Exactly. Which is why we can't just treat the Arctic as an environmental observation zone anymore. We need eyes under the ice and planes in the air.
So Norway and Denmark have traditionally been the maritime anchors up there. But what does adding Sweden and Finland actually do to counter Russian nuclear subs in the ocean?
It provides the alliance with something fundamental to military survival, which is strategic depth.
Let's break that jargon down for the listener. What does strategic depth actually mean for, say, a fighter pilot or a logistics coordinator on the ground?
Think of it as the luxury of space and time. If a military force has zero strategic depth, it means all its air bases, radar stations, and supply depots are sitting right on the border.
So they're completely exposed.
Exactly. They are utterly vulnerable to a sudden, overwhelming first strike. A single artillery barrage could wipe out your entire defensive line before you even have a chance to react.
Because you literally have nowhere to fall back to.
Correct. But by fully integrating the massive combined landmass of Sweden and Finland, Allied forces suddenly have hundreds of miles of friendly, highly defended territory to operate within.
Ah, I see.
So a Norwegian fighter jet can now launch from the Atlantic coast, engage a target over the Arctic Circle, and retreat deep into Swedish airspace to safely rearm and refuel. You can disperse your command centers deep into Scandinavian mountain bunkers. Supply convoys can maneuver far out of range of standard adversary artillery.
It means you aren't fighting with your back against a cliff edge anymore. You have a massive, interconnected backyard to absorb an attack and coordinate a devastating response.
It fundamentally changes the threat landscape for Russia's northern fleet. They are no longer facing just a thin string of isolated coastal bases in Norway. They're facing a unified, deeply entrenched adversary that possesses an endless, fortified rear echelon.
Which brings us directly to the underlying logic driving this entire monumental transformation. When we look at the Helsingborg meeting, the priorities are stark. They're talking about skyrocketing defense spending, vastly expanding domestic military production across Scandinavia, closing urgent capability gaps, and sustaining long-term support for Ukraine. It honestly sounds like a society preparing for a massive war. But the stated goal of all this architecture is deterrence, right? The philosophy that a hyper-strong defense prevents a conflict from ever starting.
Right, because the current geopolitical environment is defined by extreme friction. We aren't talking about abstract theories here. We are seeing constant airspace incursions.
Real provocations.
Exactly. There is widespread GPS jamming occurring over the Baltic Sea that directly threatens commercial aviation safety. There is aggressive naval posturing near offshore energy platforms. The alliance's calculation is that to manage this high-friction environment without it sparking a kinetic war, they basically must establish an impossibly high-cost barrier to entry.
Let's unpack that barrier. Let's say I'm an adversary. I want to test the waters, see how committed this new alliance really is. Maybe I consider seizing a tiny, uninhabited island in the Baltic, or launching a cyber attack on a Norwegian port, or disrupting a shipping lane. Just a small probe to see if politicians get bogged down in committee meetings.
That is the exact scenario this new architecture is designed to prevent. Deterrence only functions if the defensive line is utterly coherent and politically credible. By deeply integrating these militaries, sharing raw radar data in real time, cross-training troops, standardizing command structures, touching one seemingly insignificant piece of the map instantly triggers the whole system.
So the tripwire isn't a single string anymore, it's a massive steel web.
The calculus for any adversary shifts dramatically. The question is no longer, can I overwhelm this local border guard before politicians can hold a vote? The question becomes, am I willing to absorb concentrated incoming missile fire from Finnish artillery, Swedish jets, Norwegian naval assets, and Baltic forces simultaneously within minutes of crossing the line?
Yeah, the cost of entry becomes so prohibitively high and the response so geographically overwhelming that the only rational choice is to stay on your side of the line.
The entire system is designed to remove ambiguity. The Baltic states remain the forward political and military line of deterrence. Sweden acts as the central logistical and command hub. Finland heavily fortifies the eastern land border, and Norway and Denmark secure the maritime routes and the Arctic domains. It is a closed, interlocking defensive line.
It is genuinely fascinating to trace how quickly this has evolved from just a theoretical white paper to physical Patriot missile batteries and synchronized rail networks. But we have to look past the military hardware for a moment. We really need to consider what this actually means for you, the listener, and for the millions of people living inside this massive new defensive arc.
Yeah, and that is perhaps the most profound consequence of this entire shift. If Northern Europe is permanently transitioning from a quiet secondary flank into the West's heavily armed permanent front line, the fabric of everyday life in these historically neutral nations is going to fundamentally change. You have entire generations of Swedes and Finns who built their robust economies, their civic identities, and their social safety nets on the premise of peace and military non-alignment.
And now, almost overnight, that premise is completely gone.
It is. They're now hitting mandates to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense, redirecting billions of dollars. They're being asked to drastically retool their domestic industries for mass ammunition production. They have to integrate foreign troops stationed permanently on their soil. They have to adapt their civilian infrastructure, like reinforcing those bridges to hold 70-ton tanks, or expanding ports for heavy military mobility. Living with the constant grinding reality of high-alert military readiness introduces a profound psychological and economic strain. When military deterrence becomes the dominant priority of a region, well, civilian priorities inevitably have to shift to accommodate it.
It's the ultimate strategic trade-off. You give up the quiet, ambiguous buffer zone to buy the hardened, fortified shield. And as a listener, this leaves you with an important question to ponder. Will this immense concentration of military readiness ultimately stabilize the region, or does it just lock Northern Europe into a new, incredibly tense, permanent standoff? Thank you, everyone, for listening or watching, and we invite you to check out our other podcasts for more sharp, no-nonsense geostrategic deep dives. See you in the next one.